The temperature had dropped to -12. The snow was falling so hard it swallowed the streetlights whole. A little boy sat curled against a cold wall with no coat, no shoes, and lips turning blue, alone in a city that could kill him in under an hour. She almost walked past him. She almost told herself it wasn't her problem. But something, call it instinct, call it fate, call it God, made her stop. She turned back. And that one decision would change everything. Welcome to Unfold Korean Stories. Please like, share, and subscribe, and don't forget to comment telling me where you're watching from. Nia had never planned to stay in Seoul this long. What started as a 6-month teaching contract had quietly stretched into 3 years, and somewhere between learning to order food in broken Korean and memorizing the exact subway line that got her home without 3 transfers, Seoul had started to feel less like a temporary stop and more like home. She was 29 years old, born in Lagos, raised partly in London, and stubborn in the way that only women who had fought hard for everything they had could be. She was not rich. She was not connected. She had a small apartment in Mapogu, a job she loved teaching English to middle schoolers, a best friend named Amara who called her every Sunday, and a habit of walking home instead of taking cabs because she liked the cold air and the way the city looked at night when most people were already inside. That habit, that one small, stubborn, ordinary habit, was the reason she was on that street on that particular Thursday night in January when the snow came down like the sky was trying to bury the city. She had her coat pulled tight, her natural hair tucked under a thick wool beanie, earphones in, and she was walking fast because even she had limits when it came to cold weather, and -12 was testing every single one of them. She was thinking about the lamb stew she was going to make when she got home. She was thinking about the stack of essays on her kitchen table waiting to be graded. She was not thinking about anything dramatic. She was not looking for trouble or destiny or any of the things that would find her that night anyway. She almost missed him. He was tucked against the base of a closed convenience store, pressed so far into the shadows between a garbage bin and the wall that he looked, at first glance, like a discarded pile of clothes. But then Nia's eyes caught the small hand. The fingers curled inward. Too still. Too pale. She pulled out one earphone. She stopped walking. "Hello," she called out, switching instinctively to Korean. "Yogyo? Is someone there?" Nothing. She took 3 steps closer, and that was when she saw him properly, a little boy, couldn't have been more than 5 or 6 years old, wearing a thin cotton shirt and dark trousers. No coat. No shoes. Just socks, soaked through from the snow. His face was pressed against his knees, his small body shaking in that terrible, uncontrollable way that meant he had been cold for a very long time. His lips were a frightening shade of blue. His skin, pale as the snow itself, had taken on a grayish tint around his ears and fingers that made Nia's stomach drop straight to the ground. "Oh my God," she breathed, dropping to her knees in front of him. "Hey. Hey, baby, look at me." The boy lifted his head slowly, like it cost him enormous effort. His eyes were dark and glassy, unfocused, and when they finally landed on Nia's face, he blinked once, slow, confused, and then his little mouth opened, and out came the smallest, most broken sound she had ever heard in her life. Not a word, not a cry, just a sound. The sound of a child who has been alone and afraid for so long that they have run out of the energy to properly cry anymore. Nia did not think. She did not calculate. She did not weigh her options or consider the time or wonder who this child belonged to or whether getting involved was wise. She unzipped her enormous puffer coat, the thick one she'd bought in her first Seoul winter and had never once regretted, and she wrapped it around the boy's body and pulled him into her arms in one single motion. He was lighter than she expected. He was freezing. Even through her jumper, she could feel how dangerously cold he was, like holding a small stone that had been left outside in winter, the cold radiating out of him instead of warmth. "I've got you," she said in Korean, then in English when the Korean words tangled in her panic. "I've got you, okay? I've got you. You're safe. I've got you." She didn't know if he understood. She didn't know if he could even hear her properly. But she held him tighter and stood up with him in her arms and started walking. She was strong, years of lugging bags and walking everywhere had seen to that, but it wasn't strength she needed right then. It was speed. She made it to her apartment in 14 minutes. She would remember that number for the rest of her life. Inside, she laid him on her sofa and cranked the heating as high as it would go and ran for the bedroom to grab every blanket she owned. She peeled off his soaked socks, wrapped his feet in the warmest blanket, and went to the kitchen to heat water, not boiling. She remembered that much from a first aid thing she'd half-watched once, not too hot, just warm enough to start bringing the temperature back carefully. She soaked a cloth and pressed it gently against his hands, his feet, his cheeks. "What's your name?" she asked him, keeping her voice steady even though her own hands were shaking. "Can you tell me your name?" The boy stared at her. His shaking had reduced slightly. The warmth was reaching him, slowly. He blinked those large, serious dark eyes at her and then, in a voice so small it was almost not a voice at all, he said, "Seo Jihoo." "Jihoo," Nia repeated, and she smiled at him even though she was terrified. "That's a beautiful name. I'm Nia. And you're going to be okay, Jihoo. I promise you." She didn't know yet how much that promise was going to cost her. She called emergency services because she wasn't a doctor and she was scared. While she waited, she sat on the floor next to the sofa with Jihoo's small hand wrapped in both of hers, talking to him in the mixed-up blend of Korean and English she always defaulted to when she was emotional, watching his color slowly come back. By the time the paramedics arrived, he was stable. Borderline hypothermic, they told her, but stable. Another 30 minutes outside, and the story might have been very different. The paramedics were efficient and kind, but it was the police officer who came with them that shifted the atmosphere in the room. He took one look at the boy, looked at his colleague, and something passed between them. A look that Nia couldn't read, but that made the air in her small apartment feel suddenly heavier. "Do you know who this child is?" the officer asked her, carefully, in slow Korean out of deference to her foreigner status. "No," Nia said. "I found him on the street near Mapo Station. He was alone. He was freezing." The officer nodded, but he had already taken out his radio and stepped away from her to make a call in a low voice. Nia watched him from across the room, holding Jihoo's hand while the paramedics worked, and she felt the first crawl of something she couldn't name yet. Unease. The particular kind of unease that comes when you sense that the world around you is operating on a set of rules you haven't been given access to yet. Jihoo had fallen into an exhausted sleep by the time the second set of people arrived. They were not in uniform. 3 men, suits under their heavy coats, with the kind of still, measured movements that Nia instinctively associated with people who were very used to being the most dangerous thing in any room they walked into. The one in front was tall, broad-shouldered, with a jaw sharp enough to cut glass and eyes that swept across her apartment in a single practice second, cataloging everything, assessing everything, landing finally on the small sleeping form on the sofa and going, for just one moment, completely, devastatingly soft. Then those eyes moved to Nia, and the softness was gone. "You found him," the man said. Not a question. A confirmation. His Korean was low and precise, and carried in it the specific kind of authority that didn't ask, it simply stated. "Yes," Nia said, standing up straight, because something in the way this man looked at her made her want to straighten her spine. "On the street near Mapo Station. He was in hypothermic distress. I brought him here and called emergency services." The man looked at her for a long moment, long enough that one of the men behind him shifted slightly on his feet. Long enough that Nia felt the look like a physical thing, like being scanned. "Your name," he said.
Nia.
"Nia Adeyemi." She lifted her chin. "And yours?" Something moved across his face. She would later decide it was surprise. The surprise of someone who is very rarely spoken to as an equal by anyone, let alone a woman he'd just met in a small Mapo-gu apartment while his child lay recovering on her sofa. But he answered. Seo Joon-woo. The name meant nothing to her that night. She would learn what it meant later. Much later. After she had already fallen too far in to climb back out. What Nia did not know, what she had absolutely no way of knowing as she stood in her living room in her thick socks with blanket fibers in her hair, was that Seo Joon-woo was the head of the Seo organization, which was the most powerful and feared criminal syndicate operating across 3 provinces of South Korea. He had taken over at 26 after his father's abrupt and violent exit from the position, and he had run it for 7 years with a combination of ruthless intelligence and controlled ferocity that had made grown men who ate danger for breakfast lower their eyes when his name came up in conversation. He controlled import routes, financial networks, a series of legitimate businesses that serve as cover, and the loyalty, bought or earned, of hundreds of people who would walk into fire if he told them to. He also had a 5-year-old son named Jihoo, who was everything to him. Jihoo's mother had died when the boy was 18 months old, a car accident that Joon-woo had spent years not speaking about and longer years paying for in a guilt that lived permanently behind his eyes. He had restructured his entire operation around his son's safety. Jihoo had a dedicated security team. He lived in a fortified residence in Songbuk-dong. He was never, ever supposed to be anywhere unsupervised. He had never once been in danger on Joon-woo's watch. Until that Thursday. There had been a breach in the security team, a betrayal that Joon-woo had already identified and was handling in the particular way he handled betrayals. One of the trusted guards had been bribed by a rival faction to create a window of vulnerability. Jihoo, being 5 and curious and fearless in the way only children raised with the illusion of absolute safety can be, had wandered. And then he had gotten lost. And the snow had come down. And for 2 hours, Seo Joon-woo had experienced something that all his money and power and ruthlessness could not protect him from. The purest, most savage terror a parent can know. He had been 40 minutes from finding Jihoo himself when the police call came through. Now he stood in a small, warm, slightly cluttered apartment in Mapogu, looking at a woman he had never met, who had his son's small hand resting against her leg even in sleep, and Seo Joon-woo was feeling something he had not felt in a very long time. Something that had nothing to do with power or control or strategy. He was feeling grateful. He did not know what to do with that. "He needs to be seen by my doctor," Joon-woo said, the authority back in his voice because it was safer than whatever else was trying to come out. "We will take him now." "The paramedics already assessed him," Nia said, and her voice was calm, but she stepped slightly closer to the sofa. "Not aggressive. Just present. His temperature is coming up. Moving him right now in the cold is not a good idea." Joon-woo looked at her. "Are you telling me?" "I'm telling you what the paramedics told me," Nia said. "He needs to warm up slowly and steadily. Another hour, and then yes, take him wherever you need to take him. But right now, what Jihoo needs is to stay warm and stay still." Silence. One of the men behind Joon-woo made the very slight movement of someone who is very used to watching their boss respond to being contradicted and bracing accordingly. But Seo Joon-woo did not explode. He did not intimidate. He looked at Nia for a long moment, really looked at her, and then he did something that clearly surprised his own men, as much as it surprised Nia. He nodded. 1 hour, he said. 1 hour, she agreed. She made tea. She made it because she needed something to do with her hands, and because the alternative was standing in her living room being stared at by 3 very intense Korean men in expensive coats, and she had too much dignity for that. She made enough for everyone. She set the cups on the coffee table and sat back down next to Jihoo, and she watched Joon-woo, because it was impossible not to watch him, as he settled into the chair across from her and looked at his son sleeping, and the expression on his face was the most unguarded thing she had ever seen on a man who otherwise looked like he had been carved from the decision to never be unguarded again. If you're enjoying this story so far, please hit that like button right now, and make sure you're subscribed to Unfold Korean Stories, because trust me, we're just getting started. The hour passed in a strange, taut quiet punctuated by small exchanges. Joon-woo asked her 3 questions about how she had found Jihoo, what condition he was in, what she had done. She answered each one precisely and completely. She asked him nothing, because she could feel that he was a man still inside the adrenaline of terror and gratitude, and the very specific fury of someone who had been made to feel powerless, and she had enough emotional intelligence to understand that now was not the moment. When Jihoo stirred and opened his eyes and looked around the unfamiliar room with the wide-eyed uncertainty of a child waking somewhere strange, and then looked at Nia and relaxed, something in Joon-woo's chest visibly shifted. He leaned forward in the chair. "Appa," Jihoo said, seeing his father, and the word daddy came out in the small, simple, complete way that only a child saying it to the person they most needed can make it sound, and it was the most devastating 2 syllables Nia had ever witnessed. Joon-woo was across the room in 4 steps. He sat on the edge of the sofa and gathered his son against his chest with a carefulness that looked almost painful, like he was frightened of squeezing too hard, and he pressed his face into the boy's hair and closed his eyes, and for exactly 3 seconds, he allowed himself to be a father and nothing else. Nia looked away. Some things were not meant to be witnessed. They left after another 30 minutes, Jihoo bundled in every layer Nia could pile onto him. She pressed her own coat into Joon-woo's hands because it was still warmer than anything they had brought, and the night air was vicious. He took it without argument, which told her more about his current state of mind than anything else could have. At the door, he turned. "You saved his life," Joon-woo said. He said it flatly, without drama, the way a man says the simplest and most absolute truth he knows. "I don't forget things like that." "You don't owe me anything," Nia said. "I would have done it for anyone." "I know," he said. And the way he said it, quietly, with something that might have been wonder, made it sound less like an acknowledgement and more like a beginning. She closed the door. She stood in her hallway for a long moment. Then she went to the kitchen, ate 3 biscuits standing over the sink, and went to bed. She told herself it was over. She was wrong. 3 days later, a black car was parked outside her school when she finished for the day. The driver, a young man with a polite face and the posture of someone trained to be invisible, stepped out and bowed and told her that Mr. Seo would like to speak with her, if she was available. Nia stood on the pavement in the winter afternoon light and considered this. She was a sensible woman. She was practical. She understood that getting into a black car sent by a man she didn't know, based on nothing but a brief encounter in her apartment 3 nights ago, was not behavior that her mother would have endorsed. She got in the car. She would later tell Amara on Sunday phone call that she didn't know why. Amara would laugh and say, "Yes, you do." Nia would be furious about how right Amara was. The car took her to a restaurant private room, traditional Korean decor, the kind of quiet that money buys. Joon-woo was already there, jacket on, tie loosened slightly, and he stood when she entered, which surprised her. He gestured to the seat across from him and waited until she sat before he sat, which surprised her again. "How is Jihoo?" she asked because it was the only thing she actually wanted to know. "Fully recovered," Joon-woo said. "He asked about you this morning." "What did he ask?" "He wanted to know if the lady with the warm coat was an angel." A pause. "I didn't answer him." Nia smiled before she could stop herself. "What did you actually want to speak to me about?" He looked at her steadily. "I want to compensate you." "No." "Miss Adeyemi." "No," she said again, pleasantly, but completely. "I didn't save your son for reward. I saved him because he was a child alone in the snow. You can't put a price on that, and I wouldn't accept one if you tried." Joon-woo was quiet. He picked up his teacup and set it down. He looked at her with those measured, unreadable eyes that she was already learning were not actually unreadable, they simply required patience. "Then I want to thank you," he said finally. "In whatever way you'll allow." "Dinner is fine," Nia said. "This is dinner, isn't it?" Something shifted in his expression. The ghost of something that was not quite a smile, but wanted to be. "Yes," he said. "This is dinner." They ate. They talked. It was halting at first. His English was better than she expected, and she was relieved because her Korean, while functional, fell apart under any emotional pressure. He asked about Nigeria, about London, about why she had stayed in Seoul. She answered honestly, which she always did because she had a fundamental inability to perform small talk. She told him about her students and the peculiar joy of watching a child suddenly understand something they had struggled with. He listened. He actually listened. Not the polite listening of someone waiting for their turn to speak, but the full, focused listening of someone taking in every word because they find every word worth taking in. She asked him about his work. He said he ran several businesses. She looked at him steadily over her dinner and said, "What kind of businesses?" And the air between them shifted, became very slightly charged. "Import and export," he said. "Among other things." "Among other things," she repeated. He met her gaze. Is that a problem? I don't know yet, she said honestly. Ask me again when I know more. He nodded slowly. You're very direct. I'm Nigerian, she said. We don't have time to be otherwise. He laughed. It was brief and surprised and completely genuine, and it transformed his face so entirely that Nia felt the impact of it somewhere in her sternum and had to look down at her food for a moment to compose herself. That was the first dinner. There was a second. And a third. And somewhere between the second and the third, Jihoo started calling her Nuna, older sister, and would run to her when she arrived and climb her like a small determined tree and talk at her in rapid, cheerful Korean that she only understood about 60% of, and she would answer in the 60% she understood and guess at the rest, and Jihoo never seemed to mind. She knew she was in dangerous territory. She was not naive. She had done enough research, not difficult, when you knew the right search terms and the right corners of the internet, to understand broadly what the name Seo Joon-woo meant in certain circles of Seoul. She was not a woman who looked away from truth to make herself comfortable. She sat with what she knew and she examined it from every side and she tried, genuinely, to talk herself out of what was happening. She could not talk herself out of it. Because here is what she also knew. She had seen this man look at his son with a love so raw and unprotected that it had made her breath catch. She had seen him, over 3 dinners, choose honesty over impression every time he had the choice. She had seen him speak to his staff with a brisk respect that treated them as people rather than furniture. She had seen him watch her talk about her students with an attention that felt less like politeness and more like someone encountering something they had not expected to want. She knew what he was. She also knew who he was. She could not separate the two. She was not trying to, but she was beginning to think that maybe, people could hold more than one truth at a time. She was thinking about this on a Tuesday evening in February when she was at Joon-woo's Songbuk-dong residence for the first time, having been brought there because Jihoo had demanded she come see his room, and Jihoo's demands were apparently non-negotiable even for a man who ran an empire. She was in the garden, vast, stone-walled, the kind of space that said money in every direction, with a cup of tea, looking out at the lights of the city below, when she heard Joon-woo's footsteps behind her. He came to stand beside her. Not across from her. Beside her. Close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him in the cold air. Jihoo is asleep, he said. Already? He was so, she laughed softly. He was going at 1,000 miles an hour 20 minutes ago. He burns out fast, Joon-woo said. Like a small star. Nia looked at him. He was looking at the city below them, and the light caught the line of his profile, and she thought, this man should not be as beautiful as he is. It is genuinely inconvenient. Can I ask you something? She said. You'll ask it regardless of what I say. That's true, she agreed. Tell me about Jihoo's mother. A long pause. The city hummed below them. Why? Because I've been in your house 3 times now, and I haven't seen a single photograph of her. And Jihoo calls for her sometimes, just in passing, the way children do. And I think about what it costs you when he does. He turned his head and looked at her, and the thing in his eyes was enormous and entirely undisguised, and it lasted for exactly 1 breath before he looked back at the city. Her name was Soyeon, he said. She was kind. She was funnier than anyone gave her credit for. She died because I had enemies and they found a way to reach me that I hadn't protected. A pause. I protected everything after that. Except that one Thursday, Nia said softly. Except that one Thursday, he said. And the weight of those 4 words was oceanic. They stood in silence for a while, and it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind that 2 people can only stand in when they have stopped performing for each other. Nia, he said. Joon-woo, she said. He turned to face her properly. She turned to face him. They were close in the cold garden under the winter sky, and he looked at her with an expression that was part declaration and part question, and part something that looked remarkably like fear. I don't know how to do this, he said. Whatever this is. Neither do I, she said. It would not be simple. No. My world is dangerous. I noticed, she said. I'm still here. He studied her face like he was memorizing it, or like he was trying to find the catch. The hesitation, the thing that would tell him she wasn't real. He found none of those things because there were none to find. I'm still learning how to trust, he said. After Soyeon. After everything. I'm not, he stopped. Started again. I want to be honest with you, because you're the kind of person who deserves honesty. I don't know how much I have left. Of the soft parts. Nia looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, I think you have more than you know. I've watched you with Jihoo, and the soft parts are still there. They're just frightened. He exhaled slowly, like he had been holding that breath for several years. So are mine, she added quietly. For what it's worth. He reached out. Slowly. He took her hand in his, just her hand, just that, nothing more, and they stood like that in the cold garden looking at the city, and it was the simplest and most momentous thing that had happened to either of them in a very long time. Now, if you're still watching and you're feeling every single moment of this story, please pause for 1 second and subscribe to Unfold Korean Stories. Drop a comment below and tell me, what country are you watching from? I read every single one. It should have stayed that simple. But this was Seo Joon-woo's world, and nothing in it stayed simple for long. The trouble began in March, on a gray, windy morning when Nia arrived at school to find 2 men she didn't recognize standing outside the entrance, watching her with an attention that was deliberately visible. It was a message, and she knew enough by now to read it. She went inside, taught her classes, ate lunch with her colleague Sujin, and at the end of the day she called Joon-woo. 2 men outside my school this morning, she said, when he picked up on the second ring. Who are they? A very brief silence. Mine. For your protection. Without asking me. I should have told you. I apologize. Why do I need protection? Another silence. Longer. Come to the house tonight. Joon-woo. Please. The please was what got her. She'd never heard him say it before. She went. That evening, he told her. There was a rival organization, the Kwon faction, headed by a man named Kwon Hyun-woo who had been trying to destabilize the Seo organization for 2 years through a series of targeted pressures and strategic aggressions. The Thursday that Jihoo had gone missing had not, it turned out, been a random security breach. It had been Kwon Hyun-woo's opening move, an attempt to use Jihoo as leverage to shake Joon-woo's focus, to find a crack. The guard who had been bribed had been one of Kwon's planted men. And now Kwon knew that there was someone Joon-woo had been spending time with. Someone outside his organization. Someone who had no protection, no background in this world, no walls up. He'll use you to get to me, Joon-woo said. He was standing in the middle of his study, and all the stillness he normally carried was vibrating with something barely contained. Not because he knows what you mean to me, but because proximity to me is enough. Anyone near me becomes a target. Nia sat in the chair across from his desk and processed this. And the men outside my school? Are there to make sure no one touches you? Without my knowledge or consent? Yes. He met her eyes directly. I was wrong. I should have spoken to you first. I acted to protect you before I had the conversation with you, because the conversation terrified me more than Kwon Hyun-woo does. Nia looked at him. Why did the conversation terrify you? Because it means admitting out loud what you already know, he said. That I care what happens to you. That you are not simply he stopped. Pressed his hand flat against the desk like he needed the solidity. You are not simply anything, Nia. You haven't been since that first night. The room was very quiet. Outside the study window the wind moved through the garden, and the lights of the city below flickered like something breathing. I know what you are, Nia said. I told you I'd tell you when it became a problem. It hasn't become a problem, Joon-woo. Not because I'm foolish or naive, but because I see you clearly, all of it, and I'm choosing to be here. She paused. But I need you to not make decisions about my safety without me. I need to not be managed. Can you do that? He was looking at her with the same expression she had seen in the garden, the part declaration, part question, part fear. I'll try, he said, and the honesty of that, not a promise, not a guarantee, but the real truth of a man doing his best, was worth more to her than any smooth assurance would have been. Then tell me everything, she said. From the beginning. And we'll figure out the rest together. He pulled his chair around the desk, So, he was sitting beside her rather than across from her, and he told her. He told her about the Kwon faction and the history between them and the way the war had been building and what he thought Kwon's next move would be. He told her about his own operation, not everything. He was not yet at everything, but enough. Enough to show her the real shape of the life she was choosing to step into with her eyes open. She listened. She asked precise questions. She did not flinch. By the end of it, it was past midnight and they were both drinking cold tea, and Jihoo had appeared twice in the doorway looking rumpled and half asleep, claiming he heard voices, and had each time been carried back to bed by his father. The second time, Jihoo had grabbed Nia's hand as he was being lifted and said in Korean, "You're staying, right, Nuna?" And she had said, "Yes, I'm staying," and Jihoo had nodded with the supreme satisfaction of a 5-year-old who has received exactly the answer he wanted and gone back to sleep. After he was gone the second time, Joon-woo stood in the study doorway for a moment looking at Nia, who was sitting with her cold tea and her honest eyes and her natural hair starting to escape the bun she'd put it in 3 hours ago, and he said, "He's right to want you to stay." "I know," she said simply. "You are an incredibly challenging woman," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "I think I might be in love with you." The words came out with the same flat, direct certainty with which he said everything important. Not romantic staging. Not build-up. Just the truth, delivered the way he delivered all truths, as if it would be more disrespectful to dress it up than to offer it plainly. Nia set down her cold tea. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "I think I might be in love with you too. And I'm furious about it because you are extremely inconvenient." He laughed. Again, that brief, surprised, genuine laugh that rearranged his face into something that made her chest hurt. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now," he said, walking back across the room to where she sat, "we deal with Kwon. And after that." He sat down beside her again, close enough that their arms were touching, and he looked at her the way people look at something they've decided is worth the risk. "After that, I'd like to figure out whatever this is. With you. Properly." "Properly," she repeated. "Yes." "Define properly," she said, and the look he gave her in response was so loaded with everything neither of them had said yet that she felt it like a full sentence. The confrontation with Kwon Hyun-woo came 2 weeks later. Nia was not present for it. That was the one line Joon-woo had drawn firmly, and it was the one line she had let stand, because she was brave but she was not reckless, and she had the wisdom to know the difference. She was at home with Jihoo, who was at her apartment for the night under the watch of 2 of Joon-woo's most trusted people, eating ramen and watching a cartoon about a dragon who wanted to be a chef, which Jihoo found endlessly hilarious for reasons Nia could only partially understand. Joon-woo had told her, "This will be handled. After tonight, Kwon is no longer a factor." She had looked at him steadily and said, "Come back." He had looked at her steadily back and said, "I will." She had believed him. She was not entirely sure why, except that Seo Joon-woo had never yet told her something he didn't mean, and she had decided to extend that principle to this situation too, even though every sensible cell in her body understood the odds. The hours that evening were the longest she'd experienced since she couldn't remember when. She played with Jihoo. She read him a story, one of the ones he'd brought in his bag, a Korean picture book about a boy who goes on a journey and finds his way home. She held him while he fell asleep and sat in the quiet of her apartment listening to the city outside, with its traffic and its wind and its 10 million people all living their own enormous and private stories, and she thought about the particular terror and the particular meaning of loving someone who lived at the edge of danger. She thought about her mother, who had loved a man like that once, not a gangster, but a man who worked a dangerous job in a dangerous city and came home every night until one day he didn't. She had watched her mother rebuild. She had watched her mother, still, after all of it, say that she did not regret a single day. Because the love was real, her mother had told her once. And real love is not less because it ends. Real love is everything while it lasts and everything after it too. Nia sat with that. She sat with all of it. Her phone rang at 2 in the morning. Joon-woo's name on the screen. "I'm here," she said, instead of hello. "I'm coming," he said. She exhaled. He arrived 40 minutes later. He was not unmarked, there was a cut along his jaw that would leave a scar, and he moved with the slightly careful quality of someone managing pain, but he was standing, and he was whole, and he walked through her door and looked at her, and then he did something she hadn't expected. He crossed the room and wrapped both arms around her, careful, controlled, but real, and she felt him press his forehead against the top of her head and stay there, just breathing, for a long moment. She did not say anything. She just held on. "Kwon won't be a problem," he said, when he finally stepped back. His voice was hoarse. "It's done." "Okay," she said. She reached up and touched his face gently, the cut on his jaw, and he went very still. "Are you hurt anywhere else?" "Nothing serious." "You'd say that regardless." "Yes," he admitted. She made him sit down. She got the first aid kit she'd had since the night she'd found Jihoo. She'd upgraded it considerably since then, and she cleaned the cut with an efficiency that only slightly covered the tenderness underneath, and he sat on her sofa, the most powerful and feared man in 3 provinces, and let her take care of him with a quietness and a trust that felt more intimate than anything either of them had words for yet. Jihoo appeared in the hallway doorway in his pajamas, hair sticking up, blinking. "Appa," he said, and the gladness in his voice was instant and complete. "Hey," Joon-woo said softly. "What are you doing awake?" "I heard you," Jihoo said, padding over and climbing without ceremony into his father's lap, tucking himself against Joon-woo's chest the way he always did, effortlessly, perfectly, like a key in the lock it was made for. "You're back." "I said I would be," Joon-woo said. Jihoo looked at Nia. "Nuna was worried," he announced. "Was she?" Joon-woo said, and the look he gave Nia above his son's head was so quiet and so full that she had to look away before it broke her completely open. "I wasn't worried," she said. "I was cautiously optimistic." Jihoo wrinkled his nose. "What is cautiously optimistic?" "It means I had faith," Nia said, "but I also had a first aid kit ready just in case." Joon-woo laughed. Full and soft and exhausted and relieved, and Jihoo laughed because his father was laughing and Nia laughed because they both were, and her apartment in Mapogu, which had been just a small space she existed in, felt in that moment like the warmest and most important place in the world. And now, before I tell you the rest, drop your country in the comments right now. I genuinely love seeing where you are all watching from. And if you haven't subscribed yet, what are you doing? Hit that button. This family right here deserves your subscription. The weeks that followed were not simple. Joon-woo had been clear that simple was not something he could promise her, and she had been clear that she hadn't asked for simple. There were difficult conversations. There were nights when the weight of his world pressed against the walls of whatever they were building, and she felt the pressure of it, and she didn't pretend she didn't. There were moments when she stood in front of her bathroom mirror and asked herself, honestly, what she was doing, what this could become, whether she was strong enough for it. She decided she was every time, and she decided it again the next time it was asked. Because Joon-woo, for his part, was trying. Visibly, consciously, sometimes awkwardly trying to let her in, trying to choose openness over control, trying to exist in the softness she kept coaxing out of him without immediately retreating behind the armor that years of survival had welded around him. He was not always successful. He was always honest about the times he wasn't. He would say, "I shut down today. I noticed it. I'm trying to open back up." And that kind of language from a man like him was worth more than any grand gesture, and she told him so. He was also privately asking her to stay. Not out loud, not yet, but in every other way, in the way he rearranged his schedule around her school hours without being asked, in the way Jihoo's room at the Songbuk-dong residence had quietly accumulated a shelf of English picture books because Nia had been reading them to him, in the way Joon-woo had stopped pretending that the dinners and the evenings and the particular gravitational pull between the two of them was anything other than what it was. He asked her properly in April. It was cherry blossom season, which Seoul does with an almost offensive beauty, the trees erupting pink-white along the river as if the city has decided to make everyone feel things whether they want to or not. They were walking along the Hangang riverside, Jihoo running ahead, arms out like an airplane, shrieking with delight at the petals falling, and Joon-woo had been quiet for a long time in the way he was quiet when he was thinking about something important. He stopped walking. She stopped. I want you to stay in Seoul, he said. Not for the rest of your contract.
Permanently.
He paused, visibly collecting something. I want to build something with you.
Properly.
And I want Jihoo to grow up knowing you. Another pause. And I want you to know that I understand what I'm asking you to give up and what I'm asking you to take on, and I'm asking anyway because the alternative is… He stopped again. The alternative is what? She said. Unbearable, he said simply. The cherry blossoms came down around them like the world was celebrating something it had already decided. Jihoo had come back and was standing a few feet away with the enormous patience of a child who can tell that something important is happening and has, for once, decided not to interrupt. Nia looked at Joon-woo. She looked at Jihoo, who was watching her with his father's eyes and his own hopefulness. She looked at the pink-white petals on the river. I already renewed my contract, she said. 2 weeks ago. Joon-woo stared at her. I was going to tell you, she said. I was waiting for the right moment. But this is… She gestured at the river, the petals, his face, his son. This is a pretty good moment. He took 2 steps toward her. He reached up and took her face in his hands, carefully, the way he handled everything he valued most, and he looked at her with the full force of everything he kept behind his eyes normally and said, Nia. Yes, she said. I don't say things I don't mean. I know. So, when I tell you that you are the most extraordinary thing that has happened to me in 7 years. Joon-woo. I need you to take that seriously. I am taking it seriously, she said. I renewed my contract. That's serious. That's me saying yes without waiting to be asked. He was looking at her like the word yes was doing something structural to him, like it was finding all the places he had built walls and quietly offering to help with the renovation. Behind them, Jihoo made a sound that was half impatience and half glee. Appa, he announced. Are you going to kiss her? Because if you are, can you please do it so we can go get hotteok? I've been very patient. Joon-woo closed his eyes for exactly 2 seconds. Then he opened them and the expression on his face was the most human thing Nia had ever seen on him. Exasperated and fond and completely overwhelmed and deeply, helplessly happy. He looked at Nia. She looked at him.
He's not wrong, she said.
He kissed her. Brief, warm, certain. Cherry blossoms falling. Jihoo erupting into the satisfied cheering of someone who has been asking for hotteok and also, secondarily, wanted his family to come together, and both things have just happened at once. That was April. In June, Nia's mother came to visit from Lagos. Joon-woo met her on a Sunday at a restaurant Nia's mother had chosen because Nia had told her to choose and she had picked the most expensive one on the list because she had explained on the phone, I want to see how a man behaves when money is not a problem. Joon-woo had arrived exactly on time. He had brought a gift, a silk scarf in the colors of the Nigerian flag, which had taken someone on his team 3 days and considerable research to source correctly. He had greeted her mother in English, which was imperfect but earnest. He had spent 2 hours answering every question her mother asked him, directly and without deflection. Her mother's questions were not soft questions. Her mother was a woman who had raised a daughter alone in 2 countries and was not about to let anyone take that daughter for granted. She asked about his work. He told her enough of the truth that she could make an informed decision. She asked about his past. He answered. She asked about Jihoo and whether Nia understood what she was taking on. Joon-woo said, she understands more clearly than I do. That's one of the reasons I love her. Her mother had looked at him for a long time after that. Then she had picked up her wine glass and taken a sip and said, to no one in particular, Nia had translated the for Joon-woo on the way home. In my mother's language, that means she approves, but she wants you to know she's watching. Joon-woo had nodded slowly. I'll take it. You should, Nia said. From my mother, it is the equivalent of a standing ovation. He had reached across the car and taken her hand in the way he did now, the easy, natural way of someone who has decided that reaching for someone is just what his hand does, and she had leaned her head against his shoulder and watched the city go by, and felt something she hadn't been expecting to feel when she'd signed that first teaching contract 3 years ago and boarded a plane to Seoul. She felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. That is not the same as everything being perfect. It is not the same as the complications being gone or the world being simple. Joon-woo's world would never be simple. There would be more nights she sat up waiting. There would be more conversations that required her to be stronger than she felt. There would be moments when she looked at what she had walked into and felt the weight of it press against her chest and breathed through it and decided, again, that she was here. But there would also be Sunday mornings when Jihoo climbed into bed between them and demanded a story, and Joon-woo would lie there with his eyes closed pretending to be asleep while Nia told Jihoo a story in her mixed Korean English that grew more elaborate each time, and Jihoo would correct her Korean pronunciation with the delighted authority of a small child who knows something an adult doesn't, and she would accept the corrections, and Joon-woo's pretend sleep would be undone by the smile he couldn't keep off his face. There would be evenings in the garden she had come to love, city lights below, winter or spring or summer depending on the season, Joon-woo next to her, his shoulder against hers, the particular quality of silence between two people who have chosen each other fully and are still choosing each other every day. There would be the moment, several months later, when Jihoo looked at Nia over his breakfast bowl with his father's eyes and his mother's spirit and said, completely matter-of-factly, "When you and Appa get married, can I still call you Nuna or do I have to call you something else?" And the kitchen went very quiet and very charged, and Nia looked at Joon-woo across the table, and Joon-woo looked at Nia, and neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Joon-woo said to Jihoo, "Why don't you finish your breakfast?" And to Nia he said nothing, but the look he gave her was a whole conversation, a whole question, a whole future laid out between them in the space of a single breath. She smiled at him over her coffee cup. She said nothing. She let him have the question. She trusted him to find his way to the answer, because she already knew what her answer was going to be. Some things do not need to be rushed. Some things are already decided. Some things start in the snow outside a closed convenience store with a child who should not have been there and a woman who almost walked past but turned back. And from that single turning point, from that one choice made out of nothing more than instinct and human decency, something expands outward. Something real and complicated and dangerous and warm and utterly, stubbornly alive. Nia had walked back that Thursday night for a little boy with blue lips and frozen feet. She had not walked back for a love story or a destiny or an adventure. She had walked back because it was the right thing to do, because that is who she was and had always been, because her mother had raised her to never walk past someone who needed help and call it someone else's problem. But love has a way of finding the people who lead with their hearts. It has a way of building its home in the crack made by a single act of kindness and growing from there in ways that cannot be predicted or controlled or fully understood until you're already inside them and the walls are already around you and the warmth is already real. She had saved Jihoo. Jihoo, in his way, had saved her too, had opened a door she hadn't known was there, had led her by his small frozen hand into a life she hadn't imagined but could not. Now, imagine being without. And Seo Joon-woo, dangerous and guarded and trying so hard to be more than what he'd survived, had looked at a woman who refused to be managed or impressed or frightened, who had stood in his path and been entirely herself, and he had felt the armor begin to come apart, piece by piece, in the particular way that only love can dismantle what years of survival has built. They were not a simple story. They were not a safe story. But they were a real one. And real, Nia's mother had always said, is the only kind worth telling.
So here they are.
A black woman from Lagos who stayed in Seoul because the city got under her skin. A Korean man who ran an empire and had almost lost everything that mattered. A small boy who wandered into the snow on a Thursday night and came home to something none of them had planned. And it started, all of it, the whole enormous, impossible, beautiful thing, because she turned back. She always turned back. That is who she was. And that, in the end, is the whole story. If this story moved you, if you felt every single moment of Nia and Joon-woo and little Jihoo, then please, right now, hit that like button and share this video with someone who loves a good story. Subscribe to Unfold Korean Stories so you never miss a single episode, and drop a comment below telling me where you are watching from. I read every single comment, and I love hearing from you. Whether you're in Lagos, London, Seoul, New York, Nairobi, or anywhere else in this wide and wonderful world. You being here means everything. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next story.